has not been decoded, and some interesting art. This includes a small figure who could be practicing yoga, and another which could be a very early version of the later Hindu deity Shiva. There are many finely cut seals showing the bulls, elephants, and tigers so important to later Indian religion and art. And there is a very sexy nude dancing girl, whose challenging pose and bangles prefigure the erotic sculpture of much younger Hindu temples, but whose face is that of an aborigine. So it is possible, no more than that the very first human migrants from the Horn of Africa, who had stayed in India, created the essentials of Indian religion and art long before invaders arrived from the north. By the time these Indians were marshalled under Persian banners against the Greeks, however, they were ethnic cousins of the people they were fighting. Connected by the tips of their empires, the Indians of the 5th and 4th centuries BC certainly knew of the Greeks, calling them Yona, a word derived via the Persian for Ionians. These northern Indians, like the Persians, spoke a language that had the same origins as Greek, Latin, and every major European language of today. This is old news, thanks to a discovery made in 1785 by a brilliant English lover of India who had been sent to Calcutta as a High Court judge, Sir William Jones. Jones, a superb linguist, had become one of the first Europeans to learn Sanskrit, the academic language of Hindu scholarship. Spotting clues in key words and in the grammatical structure, he saw that it was part of what would be called the Indo-European family of languages. This was originally the language of the Aryans, ancestors of so many later noisy tribes. They had been pastoral people, depending on cattle and horses, who had migrated in waves from their original homeland, which was probably around the Caspian Sea or the Ukraine. Aryan is a word whose implication of racial superiority after the Europe of the Nazis can make modern ears twitch. But it is just a useful label. We could as well say that Indians, Mediterranean people, and Europeans are all Caspians, or all Ukrainians, though we don't. Because ancient peoples can be tracked by words as well as by stones, it is generally accepted that the Aryans moved to the west, driving into Turkey, Greece, and the Balkans, as well as into what is now Iran, and into India too. They had probably crossed into today's Pakistan at around the time of the Trojan War, and were reaching the great Ganges plain a couple of 100 years after that. It is possible that the Dorians were another branch of the Aryan migration, displacing the Mycenaean Greeks at roughly the same time, in which case, at the Battle of Marathon, distant cousins had confronted one another on the battlefield without knowing it. The ancient hymns, or Vedas, of the Indian Aryans, orally transmitted with great care, show them to be warlike and horse-obsessed. On the other hand, they had no words for plough, writing, or elephant. So they may indeed have had to learn from the indigenous people they merged with, defeated, or displaced. We do not know what happened, though these Aryan incomers had a culture of animal sacrifice and cattle stealing, which fits with herders turning into raiders. They had clearly been part of the wider Near Eastern family. Stories, such as those included in the Puranas, show similarities with the tales of Mesopotamia and the Bible, including a great flood in which a god, Vishnu, warns the lawgiver, Manu, to build a boat, then takes him to a mountain peak to save him. The Aryans had followed a familiar historical path. They had moved from roaming with animals to settling. The Rig Vedas, the oldest Sanskrit stories, paint a picture of a tribal culture with chieftains, priests, orgiastic sacrifice parties, and cattle as the common currency. The historian John Key has memorably compared it to the clan system of the Scottish Highlands before the arrival of sheep cleared the glens. All, whether Indian or Scots, shared a language, Gaelic/Sanskrit, a social system in which precedence was dictated by birth, and a way of life in which both wealth and prestige were computed in cattle. In Scotland, as in India, the rustling of other clans' herds constituted both pastime and ritual. But in India, as in Scotland, farming eventually won. By the time of the Scottish clans, Scotland's original forests had long gone, cleared for fuel and farmland, and leaving behind a thin ecology that could sustain few people. The Indian Aryans were luckier. Northern India then was very different from the heavily populated and intensively farmed khaki plains of today. As the ancient texts make clear, once the invaders left the Punjab and migrated eastwards, they found a lushly forested terrain, rich in wildlife and game, spreading slowly to the waterlogged Ganges delta itself. The land was inhabited by forest people, hunter-gatherers, whose way of life was comparable to that of the people of the Amazon or the highlands of New Guinea. Even in 20th century India, there were forest dwellers excluded by and suspicious of the urban and farming culture all around them. The Iron Age was the age of the iron plough as much as of the iron sword. Mile by mile the forests were burned for farmland, the soil broken by ploughing, and crops of barley were sown. The game retreated, and villages became small towns. The Aryans settled. Eventually, rice paddies would be carved out of the watery land where the forests ended. This was a long-lasting and stable change. Parts of today's India, for instance, in Bihar, towards the border with Nepal, contain villages built of wood and woven reeds whose farmers plough with oxen and tend rice and vegetable fields, burning cow dung for fuel, as they have done ever since the Iron Age. Yet soon the great Indian rivers were being used for trade and transport, and a network of roads began to link the north. Thus, under the great white ridges and the blue arms of the Himalayas, in the valleys and plains, a northern Indian civilization was evolving. As with ancient Greek, Semitic, Nordic, and Mesopotamian cultures, the Vedic Age Indians had a family of gods and goddesses who required endless and complicated sacrifices. These gods were the responsibility of the Brahmin priests, who occupied the top rung of a developing caste system. Caste is a complicated and much argued about issue. To begin with, it was no more than a rough and ready division of people by their role, such as happened in Europe and Russia too. In the Indian formulation, after the priest-teachers, the Brahmins, came the warriors and administrators, Kshatriyas, then the farmers and traders, Vaisyas, and finally the workers and servants, Shudras. This is not of itself surprising. Agricultural societies and early urban ones maintained skills and knowledge by passing it down within families. Before mass education, know-how was too precious to squander by allowing everyone choice. It was hoarded. Potters shaped potters, and charioteers gave their sons the reins. Evidence from early scriptures suggests that, nevertheless, some people could move between these groups. On the other hand, some DNA evidence, much contested, suggests that today's higher caste Indians have closer genetic links to Europeans than lower caste people have, in which case the Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and Vaisyas may be the children of Indo-European invaders, while the lower castes, doing the rougher, dirtier, and more routine work, are more likely to be descended from the earlier people of India. If true, this would be a remarkable example of cultural persistence. But we also have to remember that, in terms of biology, ancient history is hardly even yesterday. If we think of modern lifespans, say 70 years, then the Greeks of Marathon and the ancient Aryans of India are only around 40 spans away. What is unarguable is that this early Vedic system of caste became steadily more rule-bound and hard to evade. As the towns and trade grew, there was more specialization, so that functions were defined and slotted into a more complex structure, like drawers added to a giant chest. As in other cultures, the growth of towns and states led to more complicated and overbearing hierarchies of power and wealth, and made what we would call social mobility harder too. At the bottom of the scale, the worker families with the nastiest duties were turned into a subclass of exploited helots, the untouchables. But then, after all, the Greeks had their slaves. The rebel at the tree root. There were other parallels between northern India and the Greek world. As the clans settled down, many of them came under the rule of kings, some hereditary and others elected. Other clans developed a system that has been translated as clan organization, or government by discussion. More simply, it was a form of republic, in which most men had a say at regular meetings. The term Raja could mean something close to elector citizen, as well as ruler. Thus, a political map of northern India, at around the time of the birth of classical Greece, shows a patchwork of rival states not so very different from the states of the Greek world, which also had government by discussion, contending with tyrannies. By 600 BC in northern India, there were 16 Mahajanapadas, or great states, from the Indus in the west to the Ganges and its tributaries. Magadha, Lichavi, Kosala, Kura, and Panchala were names possessing something of the resonance there of Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes in southeastern Europe. Kingdoms challenged republics. How best to rule, how best to live, were issues as live in India as in Athens. Here, too, there were leagues and alliances, wars and fallings out, and great interest in the best balance of power and in the duties of citizens. There were cruder quarrels, too. One particularly long war was fought between King Bimbisara of the powerful Magadha state and the Republican Knights of Lichavi. A courtesan at the Lichavi capital of Vishali, called Amrapali, who was seduced by Bimbisara and bore him a child, was at the centre of the affair, a Helen of the Ganges. Such are the old stories still told in modern India. This same woman, Amrapali, later became a follower of an individual who was certainly more than a legend. The first biographies of the Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, appeared around 600 years after he lived. They give place names, dates, and a plausible life story. But the pause is a long one, making him the least historically visible of the major ethical revolutionaries of the age of the great empires. Confucius did not get a biography until some 400 years after he died, the work of the Chinese historian Sima Qian. But Mengzi, or Mencius, who lived a century after Confucius, did write about him, and his own reported conversations fill in gaps. Compared with Buddha and Confucius, Christ is a much clearer historical figure. St. Mark is reckoned to have written his account only 40 years or so after the death of Jesus, in the year 70, when Jerusalem fell. There are good reasons to think he may have had the stories directly from St. Peter, the historical Christ's companion. In addition, there is supporting evidence from non-Christian sources, such as the Jewish historian Josephus and mainstream Roman writers, about large numbers of followers of Christus less than a century after his death. Yet archaeology and ancient texts do explain a lot about the society the Buddha emerged from, as well as his teaching. By his time, the Brahmin system, with its priestly hierarchy and sacrifices, was very strongly entrenched, but it was also being challenged by dissident travelling teachers and sects. This probably reflected the severe social disruption being experienced by North India at the time, which was undergoing a major increase in population and fast changes to many people's lives. The villages and local markets had been added to, with sizable towns and even cities of around 35,000 people springing up, accompanied by a money culture, shops, cart paths, moats, and fortified walls. Unlike stone-built Greece or Persia, we have almost no architectural remains of a people who built with pounded earth, mud, bricks, and wood. Their words, repeated in scriptures and poems long enough to make Homer look terse, have lasted better than their buildings, or anything they made that was much larger than pottery and ironwork. In the so-called republics, or Ghana Sanghas, Brahmin authority seems to have been more questioned than in the kingdoms. Siddhartha Gautama came from one of the former, the small clan republic of Sakya, inside today's Nepal, which elected its own chief. Academic arguments persist about just when Siddhartha was born. Recent scholarship is shifting his dates forward by about 80 years, from around 566 BC to nearer the middle of the following century. But the often quoted description of him as a prince living a life of royal luxury hardly squares with what is known of the Sakya clan and seems an embellishment. He was more likely to have been a reasonably well-off leading clan member. Siddhartha married his cousin, had a son, and lived a comfortable life until, aged 29, he rebelled and set off to seek enlightenment, leaving his family behind with the briefest of farewells and no apparent remorse. Some traditions say this happened after his refusal to take part in another bloody bout of inter-clan warfare. Walking off would not have seemed such a strange thing to do in the India of Siddhartha's time. There was a tradition of men leaving their villages and families and going to seek spiritual truth in the forests, or begging by the roads. Shaven-headed seekers in ragged robes seem to have been widely respected, even if their views differed wildly. The tradition can be likened to the wilderness treks of Israelite prophets, or those of the later Christian saints and mendicants moving from village to village. At a time of social change and civil warfare, the appetite for new thinking is famously keen. In 1949, the German philosopher Karl Jaspers called the period from 800 to 200 BC the axial age, because the revolution in spiritual thought was so powerful that the rest of human history rotates around it. It seems an essential product of the greater leisure and wealth created by the rise of town and city-based civilizations, and the disturbing effect of the wars between them. As a phrase, the axial age has fallen from fashion, but there was clearly a rethinking of old beliefs going on from Greece to China. The conflict between small Indian states in the Buddha's time is a perfect example of it. We are told that Siddhartha tried some of the techniques used by other seekers, beginning with ascetic renunciation and begging in a nearby city. He gave this up to wander, study under hermit monks, and meditate. He rejected extreme mortification, the practice of starving until one was almost a living skeleton, for a middle way between that and worldly indulgence. Attractively, rice pudding seems to have helped do the trick. After meditating under a sacred fig, or bodhi, tree for 49 days and nights at a small village in northern India, he achieved enlightenment at the age of 35, finally understanding the source of human suffering. What did he conclude? That the pains of birth, illness, aging, and death were caused by a lust for sensual pleasure and renewed life, which repeats itself in the cycle of death and rebirth until overcome by mental and moral willpower. At this moment, the seeker breaks the tragic cycle. He achieves a state beyond the physical world, of pure mind and serenity, or nirvana. The Buddha, or enlightened one, as Siddhartha was now known, started to gather disciples who became monks. With them he travelled around the Ganges floodplain, preaching to anyone who would listen. The former courtesan, Amrapali, who, as noted earlier, had provoked a war, became a devoted follower. Her son became a Buddhist monk. The Buddha founded monasteries, including some for female monks. He rejected both animal sacrifices and the caste system, and survived assassination attempts by supporters of Brahmanism to live on to the age of 80. Or so it is said. And, again, how can we know? Stories of the Buddha's life and his sayings were transmitted by methodical mass chanting, rather like rote learning in traditional schoolrooms. This allowed them to be passed on, generation by generation, with the minimum of error, though corruptions will always appear. But much early history starts as oral history, and it is confirmed, surprisingly often, by archaeology. We cannot brush it away. In this story, there are obvious similarities with the stories of Christ and Mohammed. The leaving behind of ordinary family life to seek enlightenment in natural solitude, under a tree, in a cave, or in the desert. Then there is the gathering of disciples, preaching through stories to everyone, not just an elite, and the rejection of earlier religious systems. Unlike the founders of the great monotheisms, however, the Buddha never claimed divinity for himself or his system. Many would argue that, strictly speaking, Buddhism is not a religion, but a system of self-control, which allows its followers to escape the limitations and pains of everyday life. But it involved a pacifist and tolerant attitude, which made it a public matter, not simply a private practice. And it was open to everyone, of whatever past creed or social position or race. In the centuries after the Buddha's death, his followers tapped into attitudes already present in Indian thinking, the renunciation of wealth and power, vegetarianism, pacifism, and extended them into a do unto others creed. By contrast, Christianity would become intertwined with the very worldly and aggressive power of the later Roman Empire, and Islam would arm itself even more dramatically. Buddhism was indeed different. In essence, it was a radical rejection of everything that goes to make up what we call history: earthly empires, developing technological skill, changing political systems and ideas. The Buddha says, walk away from all that, and instead look inside yourself. So it is hardly surprising that, with one exception we shall come to later, Buddhism rarely features as a history-shaping system of belief. This does not mean it was not hugely influential. It spread to the countries of Southeast Asia, where superbly elaborate Buddhist temples and courts would emerge under the patronage of Buddhist kings. The influence of Buddhist monks and art in China was huge, and it spread from there to Korea and to Japan, where the story of its early art seems at times almost completely a Buddhist one. Buddhism would be persecuted in most of these places. It did not, however, produce a political or imperial system of its own. The Buddha would have been aghast if it had. In India itself, Buddhism would later be almost exterminated until modern times, and it was only under the Victorian British Raj that the Buddha's existence as a real historical figure came to be acknowledged. All the same, it remains a very important belief system. Bodh Gaya, where the haggard former aristocrat meditated his way to enlightenment under the fig tree, is today perhaps the most attractive of the pilgrimage sites of the world's great religions. Calm, smiling, saffron and plum-shrouded monks and nuns from Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka chant under the shadow of an ancient temple. There is a refreshing air of cheerfulness, and the religious tat is more meagre, cheaper, and less obtrusive than in Rome, Jerusalem, or, I suspect, Mecca. What, meanwhile, of the even greater contemporary civilization to the east of India? Konsei's midlife crisis. Age 54, a middle-ranking bureaucrat in a failing riven state had had enough. He resigned as Minister for Law and Order, said goodbye to most of his friends, and went off on a 13-year ramble. This was not a Buddhist search for solitude and enlightenment, but a political journey. After visiting many rival states and finding little employment, the civil servant came home again, amused and rueful at his relative failure. By the time he died, he had attracted a small group of friends and followers. The career of Confuzi, or Conce, or Confucius, in the Latinized version of his name made appealing to faltering Western lips by Jesuit missionaries 2,000 years later, was hardly stellar. Yet his influence was huge. For good or ill, Confucius was treated as a kind of god by scores of Chinese emperors, and had a huge effect on Chinese life. Reviled by Mao Zedong and the original communists, in the year 2012 his influence is growing again, as new generations of Chinese search for values beyond threadbare communism or materialism. A state-sponsored and fairly dreadful film has been made about his life. In the Central Confucian Temple in Beijing, one of around 3,000 such temples, where emperors once worshipped the thinker, small children sent by parents anxious to impart something more than mere facts are again being taught his ideas. Depending on one's view of the row about Buddha's dates, the two men were alive at roughly the same time. The Chinese were more careful with records, and we believe Conce lived from 551 to 479 BC. Like Siddhartha, he was born in a marginal state and at a time of civil strife and war, in which the old order was being challenged. If India had her yellow-robed forest seekers, China had her wandering philosophers by tradition, hundreds of them. Like the Buddha, Conce communed with rulers without coming under anyone else's sway. Like the Buddha, he preached the importance of doing unto others as you would like them to do to you. Like the Buddha, he never came close to asserting his own divinity. But he too would later become the focus of a semi-religion that elevated him into mythical status. Conce's China was divided, like the Buddha's India and Golden Age Greece, into rival states. After his death, it too would plunge into vicious local wars. Instead of Athens, Corinth, Sparta, Panchala, Magadha, Sakla, and the rest, China had the states of Wei, Zhou, Song, Han, and Chu. But politically, China was, if anything, even more chaotic. The chronicles for the time list more than 140 states, whose rulers and priests behaved in ways that contemporary Greeks, Persians, or Indians would have understood. They tried to divine the future by reading the cracks on the burned shoulder bones of cows, or the undershells of turtles, which was no sillier than the Greek habit of listening to the ramblings of women who had inhaled poisonous vapours, or the Roman penchant for fingering chicken entrails. What made China different was that it had been united. This was the source of Conce's deep conservative romanticism about a lost past. The states of Conce's time were themselves the shattered shell fragments of a much greater China, that of the Zhou dynasty, which had lasted for more than 7 centuries, following the fall of the Shang. Chinese imperial history can sound impenetrable to outsiders, but at this stage the story is pretty straightforward. The Shang were the first historically certain dynasty, following the cloudy story of the Xia and Da Yu. Shang China was, like early India, a much wilder place than it later became, with extensive forests and impassable marshes not yet drained for rice. Where Chinese civilization probably first took root, along the Yellow River, roaming animals included tigers, bears, elephants, rhinos, and panthers. The climate was fierce, with cold winters and very hot summers, as well as the regular flooding. Shang society was, again, in some ways like early Aryan India, an aristocratic and warrior hierarchy setting much store by raiding and hunting, living off the backs of an impoverished peasantry. Like the Assyrians and Persians, the Shang fought from chariots and used powerful bows. A cascade of sub-kings, dukes, local rulers, and fighters derived their position from the emperor. Their cities and fortresses were built with walls which, when dug up today, are still sharp-edged and hard. They had wooden buildings in the same long-eaved and rectangular pattern of later Chinese architecture. The wood eventually gave way to brick, and the thatched roofs were mimicked in yellow and green glazed tiles. But the essentials remained for a remarkably long time, China being untouched by the imported styles and hybrids that gave European architecture such diversity. After lives spent in their square, pillared country homes, the Shang nobility were given lavish burials with superb bronze vessels, silks, and lacquered coffins. They were addicted to human sacrifice, and huge numbers of servants and prisoners seem to have been murdered and partly dismembered to keep Shang aristocrats company on the way to the afterlife. It was not all dark. Under the Shang, extensive terraces were built for agriculture. Land was cleared and more canals were dug. Remarkably, a script of at least 4,000 characters, found written on diviners' animal bones, bears enough resemblance to modern Chinese for archaeologists to be able to read some of it straight off. Shang culture looks in many respects like the world of the Aztecs, with their human sacrifices and complex, gnarled art. Just as in Central America an attractive human-scale folk art had given way to ever more complex, severe, encrusted ritual designs, which seemed to mirror the more forbidding society developing in cities and palaces. Shang bronzes are particularly famous, quite extraordinary achievements in casting. But they inspire only admiration. They are not appealing. The Shang were ousted by the long-lasting Zhou, and it is to them that Conce looked back with dazzled admiration. One historian says that the Shang deserved to go. Drunkenness, incest, cannibalism, pornographic songs, and sadistic punishments enliven the catalogue of liturgical improprieties. The man who more than any other put an end to such poor behaviour was the headmasterly Duke of Zhou. His older brother won a great victory over the Shang around 150 years after the siege of Troy at a site called Muye, but had then retired home and died. Since the king's son was too young to take over, the duke led a regency council, which eventually overwhelmed the earlier dynasty and established the Zhou as its replacement under the mandate of heaven. This is an important concept in Chinese history. As a new ruling family from the edge of Shang China, the Zhou had to tread carefully. They needed continuity to keep the loyalty of the followers of the ousted dynasty. Later dynasties would have the same problem. So the Duke of Zhou declared that the Zhou were merely the tools used by a just heaven to punish the Shang. Given this job by heaven, the deal required that the new king must be reverent and kind. The duke said, "As he functions as king, let him not, because the common people stray and do what is wrong, then presume to govern them by harsh punishments. In being king, let him take his position in the primacy of virtue. The little people will then pattern themselves on him throughout the world." This was a crucial doctrine for Conce. A virtuous king produces a virtuous people. Thus begins a chain of obligation and mutual service. If everyone acts according to their role, trying to be whatever they are, mother, baker, teacher, soldier, as well as they can, then the good life and the good society emerge. Knowing your place is a positive social virtue, not merely submissiveness. This is a family-based and profoundly anti-individualistic way of thinking. But if we, in our extremely and excessively individualistic culture, do not try to understand it, we have no chance of understanding Conce or Chinese history, or indeed today's China either. After explaining the mandate of heaven to the people, the Duke of Zhou stood down and handed back control to the rightful king, his nephew, a modest gesture, rare in the Chinese story. Conce spoke a lot about the Duke. The heyday of the Zhou dynasty was for him and his generation a little like the age of lost heroes was for the Greeks of the same time. But by his day, the system devised by the Zhou, which had parcelled out the Chinese heartland into subsidiary principalities, had completely broken down. The principalities with their own cities became effectively hereditary, then started to harden into rival independent states. One historian puts it beautifully. The House of Zhou now burned only as a wraith-like source of ultimate authority, in a world where all the states and principalities had freely entered into a struggle for survival. Bonds of lineage and loyalty were losing their hold. The time, in short, was out of joint. Kongtse would come to think that he was born to set it right. He was born, apparently, in Chanping village, in the Lu kingdom. Lu's connections with the failing dynasty were particularly poignant. The Duke of Zhou himself had returned to run Lu after handing back control of China. So Lu was a rare, loyal vassal of the Zhou, or meant to be. It is said that Kongtse's father was a famous warrior and strongman called Zhu He, who married a woman of the Yan clan, and made love to her in the wilds, or, by some accounts, on a sacred mound in the forest. The boy was born with a deformed head, either a lump on the skull or a depression, and a strangely sunken face. He grew up to be notably tall. In the China of the time he might well have been abandoned to die. That he was not may explain Kongtse's lifelong devotion to his mother. His father died early, and though he could claim the status of a gentleman, just about, Kongtse seems to have had a tough start. In the Analects, or collected sayings, which provide the most authentic-sounding record of Kongtse himself, he says, "I was poor, and from a lowly station. That is why I am skilful in many menial things." He was educated, however, and managed to make a career working for the struggling and divided Lu state. He was a keeper of livestock and grain for the family of Lu's chief councillor, then became Minister of Public Works, then Minister of Crime, or Law and Order. Kongtse married, though little is known of his wife, and he may have divorced her. Since he robustly mocked writers who made up things they did not know, we had better watch our step. The later Chinese historian, Sima Qian, says Kongtse was actually quite a successful civil servant. Under his regime, lamb and pork sellers stopped charging inflated prices. Men and women walked on opposite sides of the street, and no one picked up things left on the road. At this point, we need to confront what is the biggest obstacle to a modern appreciation of Kongtse, his obsession with ritual and the correct performance of rites. The rites governed funerals, celebrations, daily meals, and meetings between people of different stations. It has been estimated that a properly educated gentleman had to obey some 3,300 rules. What we know of this period comes from a sparely written history of Lu, mainly diplomatic, called the Spring and Autumn Annals, which may have been written by Kongtse himself, and from the Zhuo commentary on them. Spring and Autumn was merely a contemporary poetic way of saying a year, or annual, but it is now the way this entire period of Chinese history is named. The chronicles are heavily concerned with proper authority, status, procedure, and rights, and for Kongtse, getting the rights right was of paramount importance, as already mentioned. It was probably a failure to apportion the ritually correct amount of meat after a sacrifice that led to him storming out of his job and taking to the road, and when his mother died, he insisted on the full set of rites, old-fashioned and expensive as they were. He mourned her for 3 years. Why were rites so important? The answer, in one word, is family. Kongtse mentioned the deity very little, and may have been agnostic himself. The sincere and proper performance of traditional rituals was a way of achieving self-control and of maintaining social order in a network of family and clan ties. In traditional China, the well-ordered family, in contrast to the Greek polis, was the fundamental unit. It was held together and got its sense of identity through rites for mourning the dead, celebrating festivals, remembering one's forebears, conducting family meals, honouring local gods, and so on. When one state or clan destroyed another, the victors would try to eradicate the losers' rights. By doing so, they were wiping out their collective memory, traditions, and identity. Rights were what made you what you were. Without rights, conducted seriously, you were nothing. The bonds of extended families spread into the early Chinese mini-states, which functioned almost like well-ordered formal tribes. But in the good society, the bonds, marked and policed by rights, also went further than blood kinship. The bonds between landowner and peasant, buyer and seller, ruler and ruled, subsidiary state and greater kingdom spread out beyond the family, but were covered by similar traditional acts of ritual. However, in Kongtse's time, this ancient way of being, of knowing who you were and what your life should be, was being challenged and overthrown by an alternative, the state. It is still too early to talk of an absolutist or totalitarian state, but these rising Chinese states demanded obedience and ruled by fear, through a bureaucracy which had nothing to do with family. It is not ridiculous to detect here faint echoes of the impact of communist or fascist states' hostility to family ties. In Kongtse's ideal world, just as the good father exercised authority with kindness, so the good ruler had to be merciful. In the Analects we read, "The master said, 'Govern the people by regulations. Keep order amongst them by chastisements, and they will flee from you, and lose all self-respect. Govern them by moral force. Keep order among them by ritual, and they will keep their self-respect and come to you of their own accord.'" Ren, which means something like virtue, led to the way, or Tao, which can be compared to the Bible's path of righteousness. Ritual means treating everyone with respect, and Kongtse's version of the Golden Rule sounds very much like Christ's "deal with the common people as though you were officiating at an important sacrifice. Do not do to others what you would not like done to yourself." If this is a conservative or even a reactionary message, as is often said, then Kongtse's conservatism is a kindly alternative to violent and abusive power. It is the conservatism of a Shakespeare, who thinks the world is better when kings behave like kings, fathers are just, and so on. In China, ritual also allows the individual to control himself, even master himself. In one passage in the Analects, a follower who has been reminded about the importance of ritual quotes back at Kongtse a poem. "As thing cut, as thing filed, as thing chiselled, as thing polished." The writer Karen Armstrong elaborates, "A gentleman was not born, but crafted. He had to work on himself in the same way as a sculptor shaped a rough stone and made it a thing of beauty." This shows that correct ritual, which can seem an eerie and meaningless echo of an ancient civilization, is not so different from meditation, prayer, or any program of rigorous self-improvement. It is about mastery and order of the self and of society. These seemed an urgent matter in Kongtse's China of warring states, increasing luxury and disorder, where even Lu was disrupted by usurpers, leaving the rightful duke broke and powerless. On the borders, barbarians were waiting. In China itself, a much worse civil war was brewing, which would bring horrors then undreamt of. Later Chinese thinkers would develop alternative readings. Montse, for instance, thought Confucian thinking was elitist and argued for a less elaborate, stripped-down system of social justice. But just as Siddhartha was provoked by the turbulence of northern India, and the Jewish prophets were stirred by the experience of war and exile, without the violence and the feuding, Conze would never have been driven to become a teacher. The rival state of Qi was worried that, schooled by Conze, his master, the Duke of Lu, was becoming too successful and might invade. So Qi's ruler sent the Duke presents and concubines to corrupt him, and according to legend, it worked. The Duke revelled in his luxury and failed to perform the proper rites. Furious, Conze decided to find a better master to serve. He can be made to sound a rather forbidding character. Whereas the Buddha was turned into a moon-faced, gilded god figure encrusted in scripture, Conze would be elevated into an intimidating-looking, court-costumed old wizard with a sinister beard. But he can hardly be blamed for that. Nor can the real Conze be held accountable for the rigidly imposed and humourless doctrine of imperial Confucianism that developed later, and which ruled by outlawing any deviation from tradition, however minor. Conze was exalted first into a cult figure, and then into a state religion, to be worshipped as a god. But great thinkers are often fated to be known only in translation. We know Christ only through his disciples. To use the Christian parallel again is not entirely outlandish either. In Conze's temples, other philosophers who picked up his thinking and tested it are arrayed as 4 evangelists, while the next tier of Confucian thinkers are lined up as 12 apostles. Though the West has nobody quite like Conze, a conservative moralist regarded as worthy of worship, yet not quite the founder of a religion, it takes only a little effort to make him seem familiar. It is noticeable that the worst excesses in Chinese history, the great repressions and slaughters, have come from the anti-Confucian side. They came from the lineage and clan-crushing Chinese emperors who used terror and savage punishments to build their states, right down to Mao Zedong, whose communist revolution in the mid-20th century attempted to tear up and destroy the powerful and still persisting Chinese tradition of the family. Confucian sayings were hacked off the walls of villages where they had guided and comforted peasants for centuries. Mao understood that if people no longer knew, never mind honoured their ancestors, if their identity was stripped away, they would be softer putty in the hands of the state. In his own day, Conze understood the wickedness as well as the futility of this. In life, Conze never found his ideal state. He tramped the lanes and roads of ancient China, gathering followers who repeated his stories and arguments and picking up odd pieces of work, but never landing another court position. By the time he died, he good-humouredly regarded himself as a somewhat laughable failure. The Analects and other reminiscences paint a vivid picture of Conze as a man ready to mock himself, who loved food, but could manage with plain fare, and was proud of his ability to hold his drink. Unlike the great Greek teacher Socrates, his conversations with his followers aimed to get at useful truths, rather than to entangle them in their own logic or display his own argumentative brilliance. Like Socrates, though, he was well served by those followers who spread his ideas across all of thinking, arguing, and literate China, at just the time when civil war was forcing men to debate exactly what a good society meant and how to get it. Dying well. Socrates, too, could hold his drink, especially his last drink. The greatest tragic scene in the story of democracy was written not by a playwright, but by a philosopher. Though Plato, the pupil of ugly, snub-nosed, infuriating, and yet somehow lovable Socrates, had had ambitions to write for the stage. Plato's account of his master's death remains awe-inspiring. Socrates had been found guilty, quite narrowly, on charges of corrupting the youth of Athens and failing to respect her gods. Most historians regard them as trumped-up charges, and the trial as unfair, even hysterical. It is unclear exactly what corrupting meant, except that Socrates was a disdainful enemy of democracy and would never keep his mouth shut. He was a famous figure who had been mocked by the city's comic poets for years, and whose circle included some of the more sinister aristocrats of the age. When found guilty, Socrates gently derided the court over the question of his penalty, and this may have encouraged them to sentence him to death rather than exile. But once sentenced, he refused to scurry off and escape, as he could easily have done. The Athenians may have expected him to make it easier for everyone by doing exactly that, but Socrates felt it would expose him to ridicule. He accepted the verdict, telling the court that it was time to be going. I to die, and you to live. But which of us has the happier prospect is unknown to anyone but God. His followers were with him in prison on the day appointed for the execution, which was to be effected by his taking a drink containing an infusion of hemlock. Hemlock, modern biologists tell us, paralyzes the muscle system and eventually causes death by asphyxiation, which cannot be pleasant. Socrates had a bath, said goodbye to his wife and 3 sons before sending them away, because he did not want any hysterical grief. He teased one grieving follower, Crito, for being upset at the thought of burying him. What would be buried, he explained, would not be Socrates, just a body. Socrates was some kind of agnostic. He did not know whether death was the end, oblivion, or whether it was a transition to another world, the Hades of the Greek imagination, peopled with spirits of the dead. But if it was oblivion, there was nothing to be frightened of, since he would not know. If it was Hades, he said, he would meet some old heroes and talk to them. It was the day appointed for the execution. Sunset approached, and the jailer arrived to tell him the time had come. Socrates found this man, who was also grieving, to be charming, and ordered the poison to be brought. Crito pointed out that the sun was still visible on the hills. Socrates could wait a while longer, as so many others had, and enjoy some more life with his friends. Socrates declined. Again, it would make him seem ridiculous in his own eyes. The jailer returned with the poison. Socrates asked whether he could spill some as an offering to the gods to help him on his journey. No, said the man, there was just enough to kill him. In his Phaedo, Plato says Socrates then raised the cup to his lips, and, quite readily and cheerfully, he drank off the poison. And hitherto most of us had been able to control our sorrow, but now, when we saw him drinking, and saw too that he had finished the draught, we could no longer forbear, and in spite of myself my own tears were flowing fast. Socrates had asked the jailer what would happen, and he had been told to walk around until his legs felt heavy, then to lie down. Socrates did so, and then he lay on his back, according to the directions, and the man who gave him the poison now and then looked at his feet and legs, and after a while he pressed his foot hard and asked him if he could feel, and he said no, and then his leg, and so upwards and upwards, and showed us that he was cold and stiff. And he felt them himself, and said, "When the poison reaches the heart, that will be the end." His final words to Crito were to tell him to sacrifice a cock to the god of healing, for he saw death as a kind of healing. And then he covered his face, fell silent, and died. How should we read this story? The background is yet again war. After the heroic defeats of the Persian armies by Athens and Sparta working together, Athens had grown swollen with power. It took a long time, 20 years or so, to mop up the Persian forces still holding Greek towns in Asia. The Athenians had formed an alliance, the Delian League, to help their navy complete the job. Lesser Greek states contributed ships, and soon, because it was easier, money instead. They slid from being allies of Athens to being subjects of Athens. Athens went from defiant city-state to mini-empire. Her democratic institutions remained, but the old spirit of the city changed. Greater wealth and more incomers meant wider gaps between the classes, as well as more citizens who were far removed from the farmer-soldiers of before. The sense of a single community waned. Her old rival, Sparta, began to shift uneasily, and eventually, when Athenian power and ambition became too much for commercial rivals such as Corinth, the Greek world went to war with itself. Sparta and her allies dominated the fighting on land. Athens ruled the waves. Year after year the Spartans would invade, and the Athenians would simply retreat behind their awesome long walls, which connected the city to its port in a bone-shaped defensive structure which allowed them to bring in plenty of food by sea, sitting out the besiegers. Peace treaties were agreed and lapsed during a long and murderous stalemate. Then Athens made a huge mistake. Egged on by a glamorous soldier, Alcibiades, her people agreed to attack Syracuse, in what is now Sicily, a rich ally of Sparta's ally Corinth. Greed was part of it, since the capture of Sicily and even eventually Italy would have made Athens so strong she could have hoped to dominate all Greece. But the attacks proved disastrous. The people of Syracuse, aided by Spartans, beat back 2 Athenian fleets and trounced the Athenians on land until the once dominant state was virtually bankrupt. The war went on for long enough, even after that. The Spartans made deals with the old common enemy Persia, as a result of which many of the Greek Ionian states, freed during the old wars, went back to the Persians. And after a naval battle in which Athens lost her main source of food and could easily have been starved into submission, Sparta finally won. The walls of Athens were torn down, and she became subject to Spartan control. The Golden Age had sunk bloodily into the sea. All this was bad enough. But the story of the Syracuse disaster and what came after is intertwined with that of one of the most attractive and yet wicked figures of classical Greek history, Alcibiades. An aristocrat related to Pericles and good-looking enough to win many lovers of both sexes, Alcibiades was one of Socrates' favourite pupils. Plato says that Socrates had saved his life in battle, and the two were inextricably linked in the minds of the Athenians, even though Socrates seems to have resisted Alcibiades' sexual charms, famously spending a chaste night under a blanket with him. As we have seen, Alcibiades had been a prime mover in the catastrophic mission against Syracuse. He had persuaded Athens to increase her fleet, upping the stakes disastrously. But before the ships left, he was accused of being involved, perhaps as a drunken aristocratic joke, in the mutilation of some sacred statues, the Hermae, which featured phalluses and stood at intervals around the city. Though he left with the fleet under joint command, Alcibiades was then summoned back to stand trial for blasphemy. He defected to Sparta, and fought successfully against Athens, before falling out with the Spartans too, and selling his services to the Persians. Later on, allies of his in Athens, where he had been condemned to death in his absence, rather remarkably managed to have him recalled. The charges against him were lifted, and he was again put in command of the Athenian forces. This time luck seemed to have deserted him, and after some defeats at the hands of the Spartans, he was dismissed from Athens yet again. He died in exile, apparently surprised by Spartan assassins while at his mistress's house, running at them naked with a dagger in each hand, then felled by a shower of arrows. Plutarch claims that the assassination had been fixed by another of Socrates' old pupils and a one-time friend of Alcibiades, Critias. The American journalist I.F. Stone has rightly said that the story was made to order for that Plutarch-reading lover of a great plot, William Shakespeare. It is the play Shakespeare ought to have got round to, but somehow never did, and it reminds us how small the ancient Greek world really was. Alcibiades and Critias were certainly dangerous men. After the defeat at Syracuse, Athenian democracy had been briefly knocked to one side by the so-called 400, a group of aristocrats who in 411 BC overthrew the government and briefly took power, a move that led to killings and a climate of fear. Alcibiades was thought to have been involved, and the coup foundered when the plotters fell out. Middle-class and poorer Athenians made common cause and restored democracy. Then, in 404, when Athens was finally defeated by Sparta, democracy fell again, this time under the rule of the 30 tyrants, a rich oligarchy led by Critias, which suspended the right to vote or have a jury trial for all but a tiny aristocratic minority. This was an altogether bloodier business. They ruled with a Spartan army, Vichy-like collaborators, using gangs of whip-wielding thugs to keep order, exiling and executing popular leaders. Socrates stayed in Athens under the tyrant's rule, even though many other eminent citizens left for a relatively comfortable exile. He excused himself later by saying he had been ordered by the 30 to arrest a man for execution, but in fact he slipped away and left the job to others. Hardly the action of a heroic resister. Once more, middle-class hostility triumphed. The 30 were ousted, and democracy returned. But by the time of Socrates' trial, a mere 4 years later, the Athenian regime must still have seemed to be teetering, and Socrates was not its friend. His death was a tragedy, not because he had the answers to the key philosophic conundrums of the ancient world, but because it showed that even in this relatively open society, the greatest minds could not always express themselves freely, or follow their thoughts wherever they led. The most pressing problems for would-be democracies and open societies, and Athens was really more the latter than the former, have never been about the minutiae of voting systems, or even about the right balance of powers, hard though these are to achieve. They have been about how to deal with critics who seem genuinely threatening, as Socrates, old though he was, seemed in 399 BC. This would be the case for French revolutionaries of the Enlightenment, for the US during the McCarthy era, and is so for today's Western democracies struggling with Islamist preachers of hate. For how long can you hang on to your principles of free speech and free thought before giving way to fear? As a philosopher, Socrates was a dissolver of certainties, a skeptic and a mocker. He did the minimum possible service in the Athens polis, was about as inactive a citizen as he could manage to be. He had fought as a soldier, but he chose not to use his great skills in open political argument at the great assemblies. He preferred private teaching. His critics dismissed him as a sophist, by which they meant a cynical teacher of the arts of argument, a purveyor of logic to suit every occasion. This was unfair. His radical doubt and self-questioning could never have produced a handbook for good living, still less a constitution, but he remains an essential contributor to the maturing of the human mind. Learning to question is more important even than learning to believe. Socrates' fluidity is shown by the very different paths taken by his followers, and their followers. Plato's darkly authoritarian republic is a world away from Aristotle's sophisticated defense of the city-state. As in China, where the supporters and foes of Confucius would lock horns for centuries, Socrates' death began an argument that has never ended. Alexander the Quite Good. We have spent much time with the Greeks, Chinese, Indians, Hebrews, and Persians, observing how, over hundreds of years, social change and ideas that have lasted to our own time were provoked and given focus by war. Technical change was happening too, with the spread of sophisticated metalworking, chariots, and writing, and with ships able to make long sea voyages, though the pace of change was gentler here. There were many other peoples for whom these centuries were important ones. Humanity's advance guard was still pushing down through the Americas, clearing land and starting to farm. The first coastal American civilizations date from this time. In the Pacific, seafarers were finding and colonizing the last major unpeopled islands, an epic of courage and navigation that nobody recorded. In Europe, the Celts, who will make an appearance in the next section, were thrusting earlier settlers aside. In Japan, Burma, Thailand, and Korea, the first dynasties were establishing themselves. Elsewhere, including Russia and Africa, we know very little beyond the probable movements and settlements of nomad tribes. All of these are interesting and much-studied stories, but are less important than the development of the four essential hubs of advancing humanity, those to be found on the plains of China, across northern India, in Persia and the Near East, and around the Mediterranean. The conundrum there is that war, at this stage, even more than trade, had clearly driven change. Yet these local wars had been destructive, as wars always are, resulting as they did in the collapse of cultures and cities that might well have flowered. We must go back one last time to the Greek world. For if there is one man who embodies the tragic ambiguity of these messages, it is Alexander III of Macedon, better known as Alexander the Great. This is the man under whom the Greeks broke the boundaries of their archipelago and flung out east and south across Central Asia in a fury of war-making. Alexander, though he came from the rougher northern state of Macedon, was a product of Greece's golden age. Schooled in hoplite fighting, he carried a copy of Homer's poems with him, allegedly using it as his pillow. He was taught by the great Aristotle, follower of the Socratic tradition, and himself a Macedonian by birth. Alexander's father, Philip, had hired the philosopher to teach the prince and his companions from the ages of 13 to 16. Their school, a leafy hideaway in the hills, has been rediscovered. There Alexander was taught about the Persians, including Cyrus, the information culled from Herodotus, as well as a sweep of subjects including natural history, botany, geography, and mathematics. Aristotle's later writings on education imply that Alexander may not have been the very best of pupils, or perhaps he was merely saying that teenagers are headstrong and don't listen. From early on, Alexander dreamed of uniting West and East, bringing together the thinking warriors of Greece and the ease, wealth, and customs of Asia. Yet, for true admirers of the Greek Golden Age, Alexander would be a fatal messenger. The Greek message for the world had been that the town was where humankind expresses itself best. There, a rough political equality between citizens, speaking freely and listening attentively, living under clear, agreed laws, could produce a better way of life, more artistic, philosophical, even proto-scientific. Law, a settled and codified system of fairness, allows people to live successfully in larger groups than families or tribes. So Greek city-states were proud of their laws and revered their ancient lawmakers. Greek philosophy spent much thought on the question of law. Greek cities had been places where, slaves apart, the gaps between rich and poor were not so wide as to destroy any sense of communality. These city-states also demonstrated the power of competition. Laws, constitutions, political systems, artisan skills, fighting styles, all improved when constantly tested against one another. Greek competition flung out questions and answers that still reverberate around the world. Is it possible to be a true republic and an empire at the same time? No. Can democracy survive vast disparities of wealth? No. Does success produce decadence? Yes. But then, after the horrors of the Peloponnesian War, this vigorously competitive world collapsed. Democracies did become empires. Athens, then Sparta, then Thebes became dominant over lesser city-states and over one another. The hoplite citizen armies, undermined by mistrust and defeat, began to give way to hired forces, mercenaries. As one historian puts it, poor, disenfranchised citizens, landless men, refugees, foreigners, and slaves became more numerous. Single and separate cities, where the citizens' voices could perhaps still be heard, had lost control of their own fates. And when eventually the largest city-states were conquered by the Macedonians in 338 BC, the true age of the city-state ended. For the Macedonians brought the leader cult, the rule of kings over subject peoples across most of the Greek world. And Alexander, for all his love of Homer, was just a very glamorous tyrant. History offers many examples of marginal-seeming peoples suddenly erupting over their borders to overwhelm or dominate the richer civilizations nearby. The Persians had seemed to come from almost nowhere to overturn the great war culture of Assyria. In China, the frontier state of Qin would soon leap on and bring down her richer, softer rivals. Macedon, too, was a frontier territory in the Greek world, beyond which there were only barbarians. The Macedonians spoke Greek, though it sounded a little strange. With forests and marshes to deal with and a tough climate, it snows heavily and can be bitterly cold even in the springtime, they were anything but decadent. They were tribal people, not town-dwellers, hard to govern and loyal to their nobility. They had only relatively recently come under the full control of their kings, based near the coast. These kings, great hunters of bears and lions, had imported some of the culture of the Greek Golden Age, including flamboyant palaces. Their new capital, Pella, had a huge central open area, or agora, where pottery, metalwork, glasswork, and statuary were manufactured, excellent wine was sold, and goods from around the Mediterranean were displayed. The palaces were richly decorated with bright frescoes and elaborate mosaics. Their gold jewellery was delicate and lovely. There are hints of a slight inferiority complex. They imported a lot from the more fully evolved states to the south. More practically, they had developed and advanced Greek phalanx fighting to supplement their royal cavalry. The more southerly Greeks, though, had not taken them terribly seriously. Macedon was the place to which it had been suggested Socrates might flee to escape his death penalty. Tellingly, he had laughed off the idea as absurd. The first great king of Macedon was Philip II, Alexander's father, who had exploited the wars of the Greek city-states to build a powerful military position. He had conquered his nearby rivals, Illyria and Thrace, in a sequence of campaigns, leading his army in person and losing both an eye and much blood in the process. His cavalry fought in V formation, without stirrups, and his infantry used extraordinarily long spears, some 19 feet long, so they presented the appearance and effect of an infuriated giant hedgehog running at speed. Bribing, menacing, fighting, and outsmarting, Philip brought the city-states, including Athens, already in disarray, under his control. It was a huge achievement. Only Sparta had held out against him. Philip had warned the Spartans that if he brought his armies successfully into their territory, he would destroy their cities and kill all their people. They replied, rather magnificently, with the single word, if. Next he planned to invade Asia, but as he was preparing for the invasion, Philip's domestic circumstances took a turn for the worse. He had taken several wives, and in 336 BC he did something to provoke his senior divorced wife. We do not know precisely what the feud was about, though Philip had also taken a younger wife. But this senior wife was not a woman to be trifled with. She was Olympias, a Lydian princess and the mother of Alexander. She was also a worshipper of the god Dionysus, and was reputed to sleep with snakes in her bed, though this was probably a reference to the snake-handling rites of the Dionysiacs. It was later suggested she had actually conceived Alexander while bedding the Persian king, who had then sent her back home because her breath was smelly. For whatever reason, Philip was hostile to Olympias, and in order to isolate her, he decided to marry his daughter, by another wife, to Olympias's older brother, the king of Lydia. Dynastically, this would cut Alexander out of the succession. But it is rarely a good idea to infuriate a Greek wife, or ex-wife. As he was preparing for his daughter's wedding, Philip was murdered by one of his own bodyguard. Many thought Olympias was behind it, avenging herself on her husband and helping ensure her son's succession. After a bloodthirsty family struggle, Alexander did succeed, inheriting a superb army and a feud with the Persian Empire, already racked by its own dynastic troubles. He was only 20 years old when he came to the throne, long-haired, clean-shaven, and with a mesmeric gaze, but apparently rather short. He had been helping his father rule and fighting in battle since he was 16. Aged 13, he had been given his famous black horse, Bucephalus, after mastering the seemingly untamable stallion. As a teenager, he fell in love with his male lover, Hephaestion, who, like Bucephalus, would remain with him for most of his short life. His father's entourage was usefully mixed. With Greece at Philip's feet, the Macedonian court attracted great writers and artists, including the playwright Euripides and the painter Apelles, as well as musicians and philosophers. But Alexander also grew up with the sons of the rougher Macedonian nobility, who were living at his father's court as pages and hostages. His obsession with the East started then, among exiled Persians and travel stories. Herodotus taught him, amongst other things, about the interesting habits of the Medes, Persians, and Egyptians. Homer taught him the cult of single combat and glory-searching, and shared with him his belief that the Trojans, those wily old Asians, were admirable in their way. As already noted, Alexander was tutored by Aristotle himself, who was well paid to educate the prince in natural philosophy, politics, and government. All this adds up to the most impressive education of any prince we know of in the ancient world. Laid out before him were the martial inspiration of Homer, the tough world of Macedon, the best of Greek thought and curiosity, and a ready openness to Asia. It made of Alexander a man ready to reach from one world deep into another, taking those territories in his hands in a mighty effort to bring them all together. His father's army lived off the land, eschewed luxury, could cover 30 miles in a day, and was supported by siege engines, archers, and javelin throwers. These were the men who would power across Asia and into India, some of them tough as old buzzards, fighting well into their 60s. Alexander's conquests offer us one of the ancient world's most jaw-dropping epics. After putting down local rebellions in Greece, once mighty Athens did not even try to fight, but immediately sued for peace, he took his forces to war against the last of the Persian Empire's kings of kings, Darius III, who initially ignored this impudent boy's invasion. Winning his first victories in what is now Turkey, near Troy, Alexander found many cities coming over to him, and copying the old Persian habit, he left them effectively to run themselves, so long as tribute was paid. At Issus, in 333 BC, he defeated a Persian army led by Darius in person, who fled, leaving both his crown and his wife on the battlefield. Sieges of the great trading cities Tyre and Accra followed, before Alexander was welcomed as a liberator by the Egyptians, who made him pharaoh, and named him an incarnation of their gods Ra and Osiris. He swept on into Mesopotamia for his greatest victory at the Battle of Gaugamela, where he shattered the much larger army of Darius, after which he pursued the Persian emperor, who in the end was assassinated by his own soldiers. Alexander declared himself king of kings and ruler of Persia. He went on to seize Babylon, and after a rare reverse in a Persian ambush, took the great city of Persepolis, which was badly burned in the process. Cleitus, a general who had saved Alexander's life in an earlier battle, hacking off the arm of a Persian about to kill the king, in 328 became embroiled in a drunken argument with him during a conference of generals at Samarkand. The Macedonians drank their wine undiluted. Everyone present at the conference was intoxicated, and probably frustrated by a slow campaign. Cleitus told Alexander to his face that his father Philip had been the greater king, and in the ensuing scuffle an enraged Alexander killed him with a spear. Alexander is said to have been distraught. Later writers portrayed Cleitus as a man speaking truth to power, an honest old fighter who realized his king's head had become impossibly swollen. Certainly by now there were clear signs that Alexander, never modest, had become drunk not only on his unwatered wine, but on his astonishing succession of victories. Declared master of the world by the Egyptians, he took to claiming that his real father had been a godlike mix of the Greek Zeus and the Egyptian Ammon. But he had a problem. He had been too successful. His Macedonians were a small minority of the combined forces he now commanded, and a tiny minority of the people he had conquered. He needed the respect of his new Asian subjects, even if it meant offending Greek sensibilities. So he adopted Persian dress, and allowed the custom of being greeted with a kiss of obeisance, which was considered respectful by Persians and Medes, but hopelessly decadent by Greeks. Alexander was now claiming to be a god, they murmured. He chose a wife, Roxana, from among the Sogdian people, East Iranians in what is now part of Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, marrying her at a grand ceremony. This may have been shrewd politics, or lust, or even love. Alexander certainly began to try to meld the Macedonian Greeks and Asians together in the manner of a true world emperor. He ordered 30,000 Asian boys to be trained as Greek-style fighters, and gave his lover Hephaestion a Persian title and position. According to the Greek-Roman historian Arrian, who wrote the most complete surviving life of Alexander, he also organized a remarkable mass wedding between Greeks and Persians at the old capital of Susa. He himself now also married the eldest daughter of Darius, and gave her sister to Hephaestion, so their children would be cousins. To another 80 of his crack Macedonian companions he gave wives from the Persian and Median nobility, in a group ceremony that sounds like a multiple wedding of the kind later favoured by the Mooney Unification Church. Arrian says, "The weddings were celebrated after the Persian manner, seats being placed in a row for the bridegrooms, and after the banquet the brides came in and seated themselves, each one near her own husband. The bridegrooms took them by the right hand and kissed them. This appeared the most popular thing which Alexander ever did. Each man took his own bride and led her away, and on all, without exception, Alexander bestowed dowries." He also ordered that the names of another 10,000 Macedonians who had married Asiatic women should be registered. It was an astonishing experiment in cultural mixing, as if Queen Victoria had ordered her English, Irish, and Scottish troops to take Hindu and Muslim brides, or as if General Custer, instead of fighting at Bighorn, had tried to mate the U.S. cavalry with Sioux squaws. Sadly, it seems, few of the marriages lasted very long, though Alexander's successors, after the break-up of his empire, did put down roots across parts of Asia, allowing a new form of Greekness to spread far beyond the Mediterranean. Further battles had preceded this, as Alexander led his armies into what is now Pakistan and India, where they fought their first war elephants. His horse, Bucephalus, was killed east of the Indus, and his lover Hephaestion died soon afterwards. Grief, wounds, and the effects of heavy drinking began to wear Alexander down. His troops on the far side of the known world had had enough, and they eventually mutinied at the prospect of further advances against Indian rulers. They demanded to return home. Even Alexander could not resist. He pulled back, returning eventually to Babylon, where he raised a funeral pyre to Hephaestion. Now in charge of a vast spread of the world's surface, stretching from the Himalayas to the Balkans, he planned new campaigns into Arabia, then along the African coast and into Italy. Had he lived, he might even have snuffed out an obscure but stroppy and ambitious city called Rome. Some say he was poisoned. More likely, he caught a bug, perhaps typhoid fever. But in June 323, aged 33, Alexander died in Nebuchadnezzar's palace. His astonishing life makes the case for war, and the case against it. Inspired by Greek culture and greedily curious about the world of the Persians and Indians, he acted as a kind of giant, bloody cultural whisk. The Greek world would now have huge influence in Asia Minor, Egypt, and deep into Mesopotamia. A rash of new Greek-style cities were founded, even though Alexander's empire had lasted for a hummingbird's wing beat. His generals divided most of the classical world between them, and a new period of Greek or Hellenistic culture flowered. Philosophers opened new schools, sculptors and painters found work in new places, and something like a common language began to spread. Yet the slaughters, the mass deportations and burnings that Alexander was also responsible for did not produce a stable or attractive political system. He had spread the look of classical Greece, but not its essence. He could never have done so, because its essence was independent-minded and civic. It was bottom-up, not top-down. Democracy cannot be imposed with spears or guns. Alexander's was an imperial vision spanning many cultures, but his huge military success merely pushed the Mediterranean back to a world of kings and emperors, local tyrants, and neighbourhood dynasties. It is possible that the reader may think of later parallels. Alexander smoothed the ground for the Roman invaders, at least the Roman emperors thought so. Inspired by Homer's heroes, and irresistibly heroic himself, he showed the limits of what heroes can do. Alexander was the gravedigger of the great Greek experiment, never its champion. Part 3. The Sword and the Word. From 300 BC to around AD 600. Classical empires in China, India, and Europe, and their confrontation with new religions. By the time of Jesus' birth, around half the human beings alive on the planet lived under one of two great empires. Even if many of them were barely aware of the fact, for the peasants and farmers far from great cities heard about the outside world rarely, and only in garbled form. This was a new thing in world history. It would never happen again. Rome and Han China emerged at roughly the same time, and ruled over roughly the same number of people. 45 million in the case of Rome at its imperial peak, 57.6 million according to a Han tax census. Both covered roughly the same amount of territory, some 4 million square kilometres, though one was based on the edges of an inland sea and the other on vast plains intersected by rivers. Their armies, marching in disciplined formations with uniform armour and weapons, chariots and cavalry, looked similar too. Romans revered their household gods and their ancestors. So did the Chinese. But they were both practical, down-to-earth cultures. Each regarded themselves as more serious, disciplined and civilized than any possible rival. The Roman emperors claimed to rule orbis terrarum, the whole world. Their Chinese rivals ruled the empire of all under heaven. Roman emperors claimed divinity, posing as gods answerable only to Jupiter. Chinese emperors claimed a similar semi-divine status. The Romans built awe-inspiring walls to keep out the barbarians, and so did the Chinese. The Romans had their arrow-straight roads, the Chinese their long, straight canals. Their empires were even divided into around the same number of administrative units. Their troops were urged on with very practical benefits. The Chinese won money and extra status for every severed enemy head they presented after battle, while valorous Romans could win land at home. The Roman Empire had been made possible by one rising power on the edge of the Mediterranean world defeating its squabbling rivals. Han ascendancy was based on the final resolution of war between 7 states, imposed by one from the margins. They knew little of each other, these Romans and Chinese. They were some 4,500 miles apart, separated by baking deserts and mountain ranges. The sea route was 2,000 miles longer than that. Yet their empires almost touch fingers. There seems to have been a confused Chinese notion of an alternative, possibly mythical, other China somewhere in the far west, while the Roman word Ceres may refer to the Chinese. In AD 97, a Chinese general, Ben Chao, tried to send an envoy to Rome to suggest a joint pincer movement against the Parthians, who, with their brilliant cavalry, were causing equal pain to both empires. The envoy never made it through to the Emperor Trajan. It was just too far. He gave up and turned back. Thus, one of the great what-ifs was lost at some dusty way station east of Egypt. The envoy Gan Ying did, however, pick up rumours about the Romans, reporting back that they had more than 400 walled towns and a capital city near the mouth of a river, that they were tall and honest, and that they selected kings from the worthiest men who, if calamity came, would accept demotion without getting angry. Gan Ying said the Roman king had 36 leaders with whom he discussed events of the day, and that he took petitions from the common people. This was true. There is some vague impression of the Senate conveyed here, and it is clear that the notion of politics, involving losers and winners, was unfamiliar and interesting to the Chinese. And that was not the only fascinating thing about the Romans. Gan Ying was particularly excited to report that they were amazing conjurers who could produce fire from their mouths and juggle 12 balls at a time. 70 years later, according to Chinese records, a Roman delegation arrived by sea in Vietnam, then part of the Chinese Empire, possibly sent by the great philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius. They were sent away. The only links remained distant trading ones. Around the time of Christ, Roman women were wearing scandalously semi-transparent silk dresses, which caused much head-shaking amongst Roman moralists. This silk came from China via long sea voyages from Vietnam to what is now Sri Lanka, and then on to Egypt. Roman glassware and coins have been found in China. There is even a faint possibility that Roman legionaries and Han soldiers fought one another in Kyrgyzstan. The Romans in fish-scale formation after being captured by Parthians in 54 BC. The empires lasted a similar length of time. The Romans, who had started as unimportant town-dwellers in central Italy, grew partly by attracting migrants and partly thanks to their astonishingly successful and very violent military campaigns. Their rise to hegemony began with the fall of the Greek kingdoms established after Alexander's career, and with the destruction of their North African rival, Carthage, in 149–6 BC. Some 70 years earlier, China's first emperor had united the former warring states there. The Roman world would fall apart into 2 empires, the Western, which dissolved after AD 400, and the Eastern, or Byzantine, which lasted until the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks. The Han Empire was gone by AD 220, though united China only really disintegrated in 317. Even then, the southern half, less damaged by invasion and culturally more conservative, bears comparison with the long survival of the Eastern Roman Empire. So each of these great empires lasted for around half a millennium, not such a long time compared with the earlier civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, but impressive by modern democratic standards. A question that is being increasingly asked by historians as today's China rises is whether our world, with a single united China but a fragmented Europe, derives in any way from the Roman and Han foundational experiences. After all, China remained broadly politically united for around half the time after the rise of its first emperor, while the Mediterranean and European West was never again united after the fall of Rome. Why? Geography, say some. China is divided by river valleys and mountains, but is also surrounded and cut off from the rest of the world by deserts and seas. Achieving political unity was no easy job. It has been calculated that between 656 and 221 BC there were no fewer than 256 separate wars in China. But once that phase had passed, there was a strong topographical logic to this single area, with its long belly-shaped coast. As soon as roads, canals and walls had drawn the lines of communication and defence, they tended to stay put. Invasions from outside would keep challenging the country, but they failed to wipe away the cultural map of the one China. The Mediterranean and European world is very different. True, the Middle Sea made it easier to move around the classical Roman Empire, but there were fewer natural barriers to halt invaders, while Europe was divided by innumerable rivers, flowing in all directions, and by mountain ranges. Geographically, it was an awkward, rumpled, riven peninsula, and therefore always less likely to hold together politically. While instantly satisfying, this explanation seems a little too slick. For centuries, China was divided. Her people in the north and south pursued very different lives, spoke different languages, and at times were ruled by different empires. China very nearly pushed out into the world with great ocean-going fleets. That she did not was a political decision. Meanwhile, in the West, for a time, it seemed as if the Eastern Roman Empire might eventually reunite the Mediterranean. Much later, rulers such as the Habsburg Charles V and the Corsican adventurer Napoleon Bonaparte came close to uniting Europe, despite those rivers and mountain ranges. What other forces are relevant? The role played by outsiders was certainly important. The nomadic and herding people of Central Asia, armed and militant, produced waves of forced migration that washed across Europe. Many settled before being pushed to move again by another wave. In China, the steppe peoples were kept out more effectively until, with the Mongols, they utterly overwhelmed the empire. But they did so swiftly and comprehensively that they could replace it with their own imperial rule, and therefore could maintain its unity. Though both the Chinese and European worlds would be shaken by the arrival of challenging religions, the effect of monotheism, both Christianity and Islam, was more dramatic in the West than was the impact of Buddhism on China, where emperors were able to repress it. This meant there was an edge, a desperation to Europe's wars of religion, which China did not experience. Monotheism would divide Western mankind into believers and outsiders again and again, though following different patterns. Nothing quite like this happened in China, where, as we shall see, law and conservative social thinking had more impact than religion. Then there are cultural differences, such as the greater difficulty of learning written Chinese, which kept a bureaucratic elite self-contained and powerful in ways not experienced in the West. These are all issues we will come back to. The story in both China and the Roman world is, however, similarly bloody and brutal, replete with tales of cynical rulers, state terror, and the persecution of dissenters. Attractively humane thinkers emerge in both worlds, and some gloriously beautiful buildings, though Han China was built mostly in wood and pounded earth, materials which, as mentioned earlier, do not survive. Yet these were also power structures, erected by force and fear, able to express their beauty and philosophy only on the sweating backs of the vast majority who were farm workers. The Roman imperial achievement relied on the incorporation of local elites and the reputation of the legions. The Chinese more on pure force. But whether the educated elite studied the sayings of Confucius or of Christ, whether they kowtowed to an emperor or read the proclamations of a senate, armies marching under central control slaughtered rebel peoples and proclaimed their authority by means of public and deliberately repellent punishments. If might was right, centrally organized and mobilized might was righter still. Ashoka. Before either Rome or Han China rose to its zenith, there existed another great empire, with a very different story. The third empire, which embraced perhaps a quarter of the world's people, was that of Mauryan India. It covered almost all of modern India, excepting the far south, plus what is now Pakistan and much of Afghanistan too. Its population in the 2nd century BC is guessed at 50 million, and it began in 322 BC, when the Romans were still struggling to get to grips with central Italy, and the Chinese were enduring a vicious and seemingly endless war between rival states. Yet this third empire had collapsed again by 185 BC, despite the brilliance of its greatest ruler, Ashoka. After the Mauryas, who took on the classical world and defeated it, India was never able to reach out and dominate anywhere else. Much of the political and religious shape of the modern world was first settled 2,000 years ago by historical figures whose names we know. The Mauryan rulers are on the edge of visible history, however. Ashoka was only properly identified as a historical rather than a mythical figure by an 18th-century amateur philologist called James Prinsep, whose day job was running the British Mint at Calcutta. Ashoka's empire is less known and less documented than those of the Romans and Chinese, and always will be. There are 3 main sources. One was a Greek historian, Megasthenes, who worked for Seleucus Nicator, Alexander the Great's general, who carved his own mini-empire centered on Persia and what is now Pakistan. Megasthenes probably visited the great Mauryan capital city, Pataliputra, which is now buried somewhere under modern Patna, undoubtedly one of the most chaotic and polluted metropolises in the world. Unfortunately, his own book has long disappeared and is known only from what later historians lifted from it. The second source is an Indian manual on how to rule, which may have been written, at least in part, by one of the advisers to the Mauryan court. And the third source is Ashoka's own words, carved in stone and on pillars across much of India. Ashoka's grandfather, Chandragupta, is now believed to be the same Indian ruler identified by Megasthenes as Sandrokotos, who had met Alexander the Great. Chandragupta rose up against the previous dynasty of North India, the Nanda. With the help of an apparently wily and ruthless adviser, he defeated them and founded his own dynasty in 321 BC. His strategy had been to wear the enemy down from the outlying areas before moving towards the centre, in a long war of attrition as the former empire gradually shrank. The legend has it that he did this after hearing a woman tell her child not to eat from the middle of a dish because the centre was bound to be hotter than the edges. Chandragupta now turned on the Greeks, so recently unbeatable, and about 303 BC defeated Seleucus. It clearly was no wipeout, because in return for the new territories he won, Chandragupta gave Seleucus 500 of the many thousands of war elephants he owned. Alexander's had been the first Western army to face the awesome sight of Indian war elephants, and he had brought some back to Baghdad as his personal guard. For the Greeks, such a gift to Seleucus was like being given several regiments of Tiger tanks or attack helicopters. The elephants were traded, borrowed, and gifted by Greek kings. The Egyptian kings, for instance, used Indian war elephants against the Jews during their revolt, and later on they would be used against the rising power of Rome. If the ancient texts concerning government are to be believed, Chandragupta's empire was not only warlike but highly interventionist, bureaucratic, and paranoid, as he spread it across most of the Indian subcontinent. Yet we know very little about the ruler described as an Indian Julius Caesar, and less about his son, who took over after Chandragupta abdicated in 297 BC, and reputedly starved himself to death as an act of pious self-denial. It is rather his grandson, Ashoka, who concerns us. He ruled from around 268 BC to 233, and was known from Buddhist writings well before a breakthrough translation of the mysterious written rock and pillar edicts scattered across India gave him a voice in the modern world. Quite who he really was less clear. But these edicts, decoded in 1837 by the British Mint supervisor, revealed a surprising story. Ashoka, whose name can be translated as without remorse, began by living up to it. First, there was the bloody succession battle. He may not have actually killed 99 rival brothers, as the scriptures say, but the gap between his father's death and his enthronement as king suggests a hard tussle. He then turned on one of the few parts of India not under his direct control, Kalinga, and after a terrible battle reconquered it. According to his own inscriptions, 100,000 soldiers were killed in the fight, and many more people died, either from wounds or from the aftermath of the slaughter. A further 150,000 were deported. A Caesar would have boasted of the death toll, so would a Chinese warlord, or indeed Chandragupta. Ashoka, however, seems to have had a dramatic change of heart, including a conversion to full Buddhism, perhaps at the instigation of his wife. In one of his inscriptions, Ashoka said he felt remorse for this war. For when an independent country is conquered, the slaughter, death, and deportation of the people are extremely grievous. Today, if 100th or 1,000th part of those people who were killed or died or deported were to suffer similarly, it would weigh heavily on the mind of the beloved of the gods, meaning himself. Ashoka went on in his 13th rock edict to warn his own descendants against new conquests and called on them to impose only light punishments. Had Ashoka gone no further, this would have been a remarkable moment in human history, the first and last recorded instance of a remorseful conqueror apologizing for his victories. It is as if Napoleon, after the Battle of Austerlitz, had announced he was disgusted by his politically incontinent behaviour and was going to become a Quaker. But Ashoka then went on to try to create an empire based on the Buddhist notion of Dharma, which means something like virtue, good conduct, and decency. It implied kindly behaviour towards underlings and relatives, the avoidance of killing not only human animals but all animals, and religious toleration. In carved edicts ranging from the frozen mountains of the north to the hot forests of the south, Ashoka urged vegetarianism, a ban on sacrifices, respect for different religious sects, and described all mankind as his children. These sayings were inscribed in various languages, including forms of Aramaic in the northwest, on the edge of the Greek world, as well as versions of Sanskrit and local dialects in a script known as Brahmi. The first edicts were carved on rock faces and boulders, where travellers might gather, sit down, and listen to whoever could read them out. Later on, at Pataliputra, Ashoka set up a factory of sorts to manufacture huge pillars topped with lions to be floated down the Ganges and other rivers so they could be erected all over central India. It was as near as an early king could get to broadcasting through loudspeakers of polished sandstone. Ashoka, no more modest than most emperors, boasts in these edicts of planting shade trees by the sides of roads, setting up regular rest houses, and digging wells. He abjures war and violence, he says. Later still he spread the word yet further, sending out Buddhist monks to take his message of peace to Burma, Sri Lanka, Egypt, and even Greece. If this all sounds too good to be true, it may be. India had so many competing religions and was so riven by differences of caste and language that any dynasty hoping to last for long would have needed some kind of unifying idea. Almost certainly Ashoka was self-consciously creating what modern rulers would call an ideology. Even if it was a notably gentle one, the actual administration of his empire may well have been rather less liberal. He retained capital punishment to a limited degree, and in his edicts growled from time to time at the forest dwellers, who seemed to have been both untamed and unimpressed by this Buddhist liberal. Even his vegetarianism was not absolute. He accepted venison and peacock, apparently, which he found particularly tasty. Above all, we have to rely on his word. If all we knew of Stalin were his blandly humanitarian speeches, we might remember him as an avuncular softy. But because Ashoka so berates himself for his earlier bloody wars, it is likely that he was a genuine Buddhist convert who tried his best to establish an empire of goodness. This seems all the more plausible because, very quickly, he failed. In his last days, he is supposed to have given away all his property, ending his life as the proud possessor of half a mango. The huge range of Indian communities did not stay loyal or united for long after his death. Little is known of his successors as Mauryan rulers, except that the last one was assassinated, and the empire broke up to be followed by half a century of chaos. Eventually it would be followed by a silver or even a golden age under the Gupta dynasty, who began to rule in AD 320 and under whom Sanskrit writing, decimal mathematics, and other advances flourished. When the Muslims poured into northern India, they began to force the Buddhists out. Facing Hindu hostility too, Ashoka's creed virtually vanished from India. Yet he is rather more than a footnote in history. Modern India, with its jagged fissures between different religious and ethnic groups, rediscovering year by year just how hard tolerance is, has adopted Ashoka as an intellectual hero. Ashoka's three-headed lion is one of the Republic's most familiar symbols, appearing, for instance, on its banknotes. And in 1956 there was an eloquent protest against religious intolerance, showing that Ashokan political Buddhism was not quite dead. B.R. Ambedkar was one of the great figures of early Indian democracy, a brilliant lawyer from the untouchable caste. He rose to chair the committee that wrote the new republic's constitution, which abolished untouchable status and gave special voting rights to this out-group of labourers, cobblers, cleaners, and dirty work specialists. But Ambedkar remained deeply frustrated and angered by India's failure to do more for his people. To him, whatever the letter of the law, Hindu caste prejudice, religious prejudice, was still a fact of Indian life. So, in 1956, shortly before he died, at a ceremony attended by vast numbers, he publicly converted to Buddhism. 1 million people attended his funeral, and many of his lower caste followers also became Buddhists, contributing to a revival of the belief system in today's India. Clearly, some of the moral message of Ashoka's pillars was still crackling through the airwaves. The First Emperor. China's first emperor is about as radical a departure from the benign, if naive, figure of Ashoka as it is possible to imagine. Qin Shi Huangzhong, who ruled at roughly the same time, also erected stone pillars on hilltops to proclaim his works. But Zhong was not to be remembered in his own words. His reputation for paranoia, cruelty, and ruthlessness came from a scandalous later history. It has been bolstered in recent times by the discovery of part of the awesome Death City he had constructed for himself, featuring the world-famous terracotta army. If Ashoka was seeking the annihilation of all appetites and of selfhood, Zheng wanted to be protected forever by a bureaucracy and a military machine made of mud and bronze, all painted and ready to repel demons. His was an earthly vision, born of conquest and fear, which would have made more sense to Romans and even Egyptians than Ashoka's Buddhist withdrawal. Zheng is more potent in today's China and around today's world than is Ashoka. Though, like the Indian rulers, his dynasty disappeared quickly, Zheng's was just as quickly replaced by the Han dynasty, which picked up his political achievements, minus some of the savage paranoia. He may have been an unpleasant character, but he unified Chinese scripts, built great public works, finally ended centuries of civil war, and enlarged the idea of China itself. His message for humanity may be a sour-faced one, but it has stuck. One of the biggest problems concerning Zheng is the written history available to us. It is by Sima Qian, whom we met earlier as the first biographer of Confucius. He is one of the great literary figures of Chinese history writing, an Asian Plutarch whose own life was marked by tragedy. Like his contemporary Latin historians, he knew very well that overstepping the mark in criticizing rulers could result in exile or death, or, in his case, castration. Again, like other historians, Sima Qian seems to have realized that he could make coded criticisms of his own rulers by attacking their predecessors, particularly if they had been defeated. So he passes on the worst scuttlebutt about Zheng. His chronicle, the Shi Ji, a history of the Chinese dynasties, tells us that Zheng was probably the son of a barrow boy merchant, an immigrant to the state of Qin called Lu Buwei. This merchant had a beautiful lover who caught the eye of the crown prince. He handed her over. The courtesan, however, was already pregnant. She passed off the child as the prince's. The prince became king and the courtesan his queen. A baby was born. The child was Zheng, and thus a bastard and a fraud. Yet, aged 13, he rose to the throne of the state of Qin when his father died. Bad enough, but at this point the story becomes really racy. The merchant, Lu Buwei, returned to the arms of his lover, now the dowager queen, but became tired of her. But at this point it is probably best to quote directly from our historian. He therefore searched about in secret until he found a man named Lao Ai, who had an unusually large penis. When an occasion arose, he had suggestive music performed, and instructing Lao Ai to stick his penis through the centre of a wheel made of paulownia wood, had him walk about with it, making certain that the report of this reached the ears of the Queen Dowager so as to excite her interest. And excited it was. In an attempt to hush the gossip, Lu Buwei first had the well-hung Lao Ai convicted of some minor charge and sentenced to castration. The operation was faked, however, and with some extra careful shaving of the face to suggest he had become a eunuch, Lao Ai was left to enjoy a happy life in private with the Queen, now an empress. She gave him gifts and 2 children. Sadly for them both, however, Zheng, by now surrounded by a strangely behaving mother, dodgy adviser, who was also his rumoured real father, a fake eunuch, and 2 half-brothers who were potential successors, decided the time had come to assert himself. He exiled his mother, though she eventually came back. He exiled Lu Buwei, who later on decided to poison himself rather than face a further banishment. He had the half-brothers killed, and he had Lao Ai, the erotic wheel-spinner, torn into 4 by chariots attached to his limbs. Their supporters were beheaded or banished, but mainly beheaded. Had the filmmaker Quentin Tarantino turned his hand to Shakespeare's Hamlet, the effects could hardly have been more satisfactorily splattered. But, of course, none of this may be true. We have Sima Qian's word to take on trust, or perhaps those of later anonymous mudslinger historians who added to the record. These were all working for the Han Empire, which replaced the Qin, and had no reason to boost Zhong's reputation. Yet Sima Qian, at least, seems to have been a painstakingly serious writer. He fell out with a later emperor when he defended a friend, a general, who had lost his army. For this misdemeanour, Sima Qian